Roughly 5 days after the bodies were released, Jake Reiner was listed as the informant on the death certificates and took on the responsibility of receiving his parents' ashes. The funeral and cremation took place at Mount C Mortuary, a highly regarded Jewish funeral home in Hollywood Hills. The mortuary adhered to Jewish customs for the burial process, which emphasized speed, respect, and dignity. Afterward, Rob and Michelle's ashes were temporarily kept in Jake's home. However, sources close to the family revealed that no decision had been made about a final resting place for Rob and Michelle. Discussions were reportedly taking place about whether to scatter the ashes at a location that held deep significance for the family or place them in a family cemetery. As grief turned to uncertainty, things started to escalate behind the scenes. Roy and Jake were seen entering a high-profile law office in Beverly Hills, known for its experience handling inheritance disputes for Hollywood's elite. Dressed in somber dark clothing and sunglasses, they appeared distant, not wanting to draw attention, but the cameras knew where to focus. The reports quickly spread about a looming inheritance battle over Rob's $200 million estate, sending shockwaves through the media. The family was thrust into a situation they had not been prepared for, and it seemed like every step they took was being watched. When reporters bombarded them with questions about the estate and whether the will had even been officially validated yet, the pressure mounted. One question seemed to hit especially hard. Who would manage Rob's massive fortune now that he was gone? Jake and Romy, despite their grief, continued to say very little in public. They kept their emotions tightly guarded. Romy, in particular, seemed overwhelmed, while Jake, the eldest son, walked a few paces ahead, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, seemingly trying to protect his younger sister from the media frenzy. Despite their silence, the pressure only grew. The public's curiosity was relentless, and the family's every move felt like it was being dissected. Journalists crowded closer and pressed harder, asking not just about the details of the will, but about the legal procedures involved. Were there any conditions under which Rob's fortune could be distributed to the children? Were there any exceptions or provisions? It became clear that the media was eager to uncover every inch of detail about the family's financial future, just as much as they were interested in the personal aspects of their grief. It wasn't until a few days later that the truth about Rob's decision began to emerge, though it was almost too late to soften the sting. According to a trusted family source, Rob had made his intentions very clear long before his death. Nearly all of his fortune, which was estimated to be worth $200 million, was intended to go to charitable organizations. The family was not expected to receive anything, and that was a choice Rob had made for very specific reasons. While this revelation didn't come as a total surprise to some, the realization that the family had been left out of the inheritance left them reeling. Sources close to Rob revealed that his decision was not made out of bitterness toward his children, nor was it about abandoning them. Rather, it was based on a deeply held belief that excessive wealth could harm people more than help them. Rob had always believed that his children needed to stand on their own 2 feet, without the crutch of his wealth. For Rob, the idea of leaving them a fortune was not an expression of love, but a potential hindrance to their own growth and self-reliance. In his eyes, the real gift he could give his children was the opportunity to learn how to navigate life without the safety net of inherited money. Rob's reasoning was clear. He wanted his children to have the drive and ambition to carve out their own paths. He was deeply concerned that giving them large sums of money would dilute their drive to work hard and make something of themselves. He feared that they would not fully appreciate the value of hard-earned success if they were handed everything on a silver platter. Rob once explained that shielding his children from hardship could be more damaging than preparing them to face life's challenges head-on. According to a family friend, Rob had often joked about this in private, saying, "Parents don't live to pave the road for their children. They live to teach them how to walk." It wasn't just a philosophy. It was a guiding principle he held throughout his life. Rob's approach was not about punishment or neglect, but about the belief that true success came from struggling, learning, and eventually thriving on one's own terms. His close friends said that he believed his children were already strong enough to face the world without his help. Jake had a career of his own and had lived independently for years, while Romy had built her career in tea. He arts with dedication and hard work. They were, in Rob's view, already strong, capable people. But when it came to Nick, Rob had reservations. Nick was still struggling to find his place in the world, and Rob feared that giving him an inheritance would only make him more complacent and less likely to fight for his own success. Rob's decision to leave the bulk of his estate to charity was in part an effort to push his children to find their own way, and not depend on a legacy that might inadvertently weaken them. As the legal battle began to unfold, Jake and Romy found themselves caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Neither of them was opposed to charity or to the idea of helping others, but the sting of being excluded from their father's fortune was too great to ignore. Romy was reportedly devastated by the revelation. According to sources close to the family, she had a breakdown during one of the early meetings with the lawyers, repeatedly saying, "This isn't fair." For her, the will didn't just represent money, it represented her place in her father's life and legacy. To her, being excluded felt like being erased from the family story. Jake, on the other hand, had a much more direct response. His anger was fierce, and he reportedly accused his father of being selfish. He felt that Rob had chosen to give everything to the world, while leaving his own children with nothing. Jake's frustration was not about greed, but about feeling abandoned at the worst possible moment. The emotional toll of losing their parents was compounded by the realization that they had been left to fight for what they felt was rightfully theirs. As the weeks passed, the siblings began exploring their legal options. They reviewed the conditions of Rob's will, looking for any way they could contest it or challenge the charitable distributions. They hired some of the best estate attorneys in Los Angeles, known for handling high-stakes inheritance cases in Hollywood. Romy and Jake retained Daniel Cross, a litigator known for his aggressive approach to challenging wills, and Evelyn Hartman, an expert in trust law. It was no longer just a matter of dealing with grief. It had turned into a full-blown legal battle, with each side digging in their heels. In those early meetings, Jake reportedly asked the question that would linger for a long time. Are we still their children or just details that can be discarded? The question, simple but cutting, hung in the air. No legal arguments could address the deeper emotional wound that had been inflicted. As they began to prepare for the battle ahead, Jake and Romy understood that they were fighting not just for money, but for the recognition and validation of their place in the world and in their father's legacy. The journey ahead was going to be long, painful, and filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. The Reiner family was not going to go down without a fight. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the shock of Rob's will become more and more painful for the family to absorb. Those close to Rob knew he had always been a man driven by a deep sense of philanthropy, but the idea that his children, his flesh and blood, would be left out of the equation entirely was hard to digest. The family was reeling from the loss of their father and mother, and now they were being forced to grapple with the fact that their inheritance was being directed elsewhere. Jake, in particular, struggled to make sense of the decision. According to close family friends, he couldn't hide his sense of betrayal. It felt like a cruel joke, one source recalled. Like all their years of being his children, all the love and moments shared meant nothing. His frustration was palpable, and it quickly turned into resentment. It wasn't that he didn't understand the notion of charity. Rob had always been a vocal supporter of various causes, donating millions over the years. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that, in the end, his father's actions reflected a deeper, more complex view of their relationship than he had ever known. For Romy, the revelation was even more painful. As the youngest child, she had always tried to hold onto a sense of closeness with her father. She had been present for many of Rob's public engagements and often spoke of the warmth and guidance he had provided her growing up. Now, however, she was left questioning her own place in her father's life. It wasn't just about the money. For Romy, it was about the symbolic nature of the will, a silent acknowledgement that she and her brother were no longer his primary focus. The emotional weight of that decision hit her hard. She had always looked up to her father, admiring his ability to navigate the complexities of life with a calm, confident demeanor. Yet now, in the wake of his passing, she found herself grappling with the stark reality that she was no longer central to his legacy. To complicate matters, the question of whether the will was legally valid soon became a major point of contention. The family, now split between their grief and anger, began seeking legal advice on how to challenge the will. They were faced with a labyrinth of options, each more complex than the last. Were there any loopholes they could exploit? Was Rob of sound mind when he made the decision? Was there any way they could contest the charitable donations and claim at least a portion of his wealth? The family was now embroiled in an intense legal battle that would drag on for months. The media, meanwhile, grew ever more fascinated with the story. Headlines screamed about the family betrayal and the Reiner inheritance scandal, casting the siblings in a public light that they never asked for. They were no longer seen as Rob's children, but as pawns in a much larger and more complicated narrative. The public and media alike were consumed by the questions of who would inherit Rob's fortune, and the family found themselves at the mercy of an insatiable press, with every detail of their personal life exposed for all to see. At the same time, the rest of Rob's estate, his vast collection of real estate holdings, fine art, and investments, began to come under scrutiny. The value of his assets was astronomical, and as they began to sift through the details, it became clear that Rob had taken painstaking care to ensure that his wealth would be distributed to the causes he felt mattered most. His long-standing commitment to charity was reflected in the size and scope of his bequests. The Reiner family, however, was still left with a lingering sense of injustice. It wasn't just about a fortune that had been taken away from them. It was about the legacy their father had left behind and how they would have to fight to maintain a place in it. Despite the public spectacle and the bitterness that was growing within the family, Jake and Romy found themselves bonded in a new way. They knew that, despite their differences, they would need each other more than ever in the months ahead. They shared the same grief, the same disbelief at their father's decision, and they began to lean on each other for support. For a time, their relationship, already fraught with tensions due to years of competing expectations from their parents, seemed to heal. The shared responsibility of dealing with the inheritance became a defining moment for the two of them. It wasn't just about mourning the loss of their parents anymore. It was about figuring out who they were without the buffer of their father's wealth, without the safety net that had always been a part of their lives. As the legal battle continued, the pressure on the Reiner family only intensified. With every passing day, the emotional and financial strain took its toll on Jake, Romy, and Roy. They were all forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationship with their father, their place in his world, and their role in his legacy. They had spent so much time being defined by their father's success and fortune that they never truly considered what life would be like when they had to define themselves without it. The inheritance, once a symbol of security and family pride, now stood as a reminder of the fragility of their bond and the complex, sometimes painful reality of family dynamics. The media attention was relentless, but in many ways, it only highlighted the very emotional void the family was trying to fill. As they tried to navigate the legal system and their personal turmoil, they were also forced to grapple with the idea that their father's decision may have been a calculated attempt to protect them from the very thing they were now fighting for: money. He had believed that the pursuit of wealth could cloud the true purpose of life. In leaving the fortune to charity, he may have been trying to teach his children a lesson they were only beginning to understand: that true wealth lay not in material possessions, but in personal growth, resilience, and the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet. But even as the legal battle raged on, the Reiner children were left wondering if they would ever feel like they truly understood their father's intentions. Would they ever be able to forgive him for leaving them out of his will? Would they come to see the wisdom behind his decision, or would the wounds of betrayal prove too deep to heal? The journey ahead remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Reiner family's fight for their father's legacy was far from over. As the details of Rob's decision became clearer, the Reiner family was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of his beliefs. While the idea of being excluded from their father's fortune stung deeply, it was the reasoning behind his decision that left the most lasting impression. Rob's commitment to self-reliance, personal growth, and the idea that hardship was essential to building character were not just philosophical ideals. They were core principles that had guided his life. To him, wealth was not a tool to be passed down like a family heirloom. Instead, it was a potential barrier to the very qualities that he believed were vital for success: resilience, ambition, and independence. His children, particularly Jake and Romy, had always known their father as a man who valued hard work above all else. They had witnessed him push through challenges, fight for what he believed in, and build an empire from the ground up. It was only natural that, in Rob's mind, his children should experience that same sense of accomplishment by navigating the world on their own terms. The idea of giving them large sums of money would, in his eyes, undermine everything he had worked for, not just professionally, but as a father. Jake, having built his own career and achieved success through his own efforts, might have understood this philosophy on some level. He had always been fiercely independent, driven by his own ambitions rather than relying on his father's influence. But the sting of being excluded from the inheritance was still too much to bear. The emotions surrounding Rob's death were already raw, and now Jake was forced to reconcile his admiration for his father's values with the deep sense of personal loss. It was one thing to understand a principle. It was another to feel the weight of it in a time of crisis. For Romy, the pain was more profound. She had worked diligently to establish herself in the arts, striving to build a name for herself outside of her father's shadow. But like her brother, she had always looked to Rob for guidance, love, and support. Now, in the wake of his death, she was left with the haunting realization that her father's way of showing love wasn't through material wealth. Rob had always been emotionally available, but his decision to withhold financial inheritance felt like a rejection of her very worth. She couldn't help but question whether she had truly understood her father's love, or whether, in his eyes, she had never needed it in the way she had hoped. It was Nick, however, who seemed to be the one most deeply affected by Rob's decision. While Jake and Romy had each carved out their own paths, Nick had struggled to find his place in the world. His career was uncertain, and his ambitions, though real, hadn't yet fully materialized. Rob's concern about Nick's complacency in the face of a large inheritance struck a nerve. Nick, like many others, had often wrestled with his own self-doubt. He had never been as confident or driven as his siblings, and the idea of receiving nothing from his father's estate only compounded his feelings of inadequacy. It felt like the ultimate validation of his fears, that, in Rob's eyes, he wasn't capable of achieving greatness on his own. The emotional toll this took on Nick was immense, and it added another layer of complexity to the family's grief. As the legal battle continued, the Reiner children found themselves grappling not just with the estate, but with their father's legacy, what it meant, how to carry it forward, and whether they could ever truly reconcile the man they had known with the choices he had made in his will. For some, it was a deep sense of anger and betrayal, a feeling that their father's wealth could have been a cushion in an already painful time. For others, there was a begrudging respect for his conviction, even if it didn't align with their desires or needs. The fight for the estate became symbolic of their larger struggle to find their own place in a world without Rob's guidance, without the safety net he had once represented. The legacy Rob left behind, while clearly rooted in a desire to see his children thrive, was one that came with a heavy price. His philosophy was one of tough love, but to his children it felt like abandonment. They were now left to figure out how to reconcile their father's absence with the lessons he had instilled in them. Could they rise to the challenge of living without the wealth that had defined so much of their lives? Would they ever understand the wisdom behind Rob's decision? Or would the wound of his exclusion remain a source of division forever? The story of Rob Reiner's inheritance was, in many ways, a tragedy of its own, one that unfolded not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of his children. It revealed a complex dynamic, one that went beyond wealth and possessions, touching on the fundamental question of what it meant to be loved by a parent, and how far a parent would go to ensure their children's growth and success. In the end, Rob's decision wasn't about withholding love, but about trying to ensure his children learned the most important lesson of all: how to stand on their own, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. As the legal battle intensified, the weight of the situation began to take a serious toll on both Jake and Romy. At first, it was difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when the grief turned into anger. But somewhere between the endless meetings with their father's lawyers and the crushing realization that they were fighting for something that had already been decided, the siblings became consumed by a sense of betrayal that ran deeper than anything Why had ever imagined? Romy, ever the more reserved of the two, had always held her emotions close. But the revelation about the will broke her in ways that no one could have predicted. It wasn't just the exclusion from the fortune. It was the sense of being unseen, unnoticed, as if her very existence had been minimized. Sitting in those cold, sterile rooms, surrounded by lawyers and legal jargon, Romy felt a wave of disconnection from the father she thought she knew. Each word that came from their attorneys seemed to confirm her worst fear. She had never been truly seen by him. It wasn't the money, she kept repeating to herself. But the truth was, it had never been just about the money. The fortune symbolized something deeper, something that had always existed between her and her father. His wealth had never been a burden, it had been a connection. Being excluded felt like being erased from the family narrative, like she no longer had a role in the story of his life. At one particularly tense meeting with their lawyers, Romy's composure cracked. The calm, controlled woman that the world saw was gone, replaced by a daughter in agony. "This isn't fair," she whispered, almost to herself, but loud enough for those present to hear. It was a simple phrase, one that carried all the weight of a broken heart, a shattered sense of identity, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. Her breakdown didn't go unnoticed. Even Jake, who had long been the more outwardly emotional one, was taken aback by the sight of his sister so vulnerable. He had always seen Romy as the stronger one, the one who kept things together, who held the family together when their parents were still alive. But now, she was the one unraveling, and the burden of it all seemed too much to bear. Jake, meanwhile, was struggling with his own turmoil. His response to the will had been explosive, a storm of anger that neither his attorneys nor Romy could contain. He could never understand Rob's decision to prioritize charity over his own flesh and blood. The will seemed to him not just an act of philanthropy, but an outright rejection. It wasn't about the money. It was about his father's betrayal, the sharp sting of being abandoned at the worst possible moment. In the chaos of grief and loss, Jake's fury became the defining emotion. To him, Rob's choice felt like a slap in the face, as if his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. His father had always spoken about the importance of family, about legacy and loyalty, and yet when it came down to it, Rob had decided that his children weren't worthy of the inheritance. The hardest part for Jake was reconciling the image of his father, the man he had admired and respected, with the reality of the will. How could someone who had been so present, so involved in their lives, suddenly choose to leave them with nothing? The legal battle became not just a fight for money, but a battle for their emotional dignity. Jake couldn't bear the thought that his father had abandoned them in their most vulnerable moment. With each passing day, their lawyers worked tirelessly, reviewing the will's fine print, looking for any loopholes or weaknesses that could be exploited. But the more they dug, the more they realized just how airtight Rob's decisions were. He had left everything to the causes he believed in, and that left little room for maneuvering. The children were not simply overlooked, they were explicitly written out of his final testament. As Jake and Romy began to piece together their legal strategy, they found themselves at odds. Where Romy wanted to proceed cautiously, with careful consideration of the long-term emotional consequences, Jake was determined to fight with everything he had. He wanted to expose what he saw as the hypocrisy of his father's choices. He couldn't let Rob's last act stand as the defining moment of their relationship. It was as if Jake believed that winning this battle would somehow validate everything he had ever believed about his father's love and their place in his life. But the deeper they dove into the legal process, the more it became clear that their father's will wasn't just a legal document. It was a reflection of his philosophy, his deep-seated beliefs about self-reliance, and his view on wealth. Rob had always talked about the dangers of wealth and how it could corrupt. His will, in many ways, was an expression of that belief. By leaving everything to charity, he had hoped to protect his children from the very curse he thought he was escaping. But for Jake and Romy, that didn't make it any easier to swallow. The emotional toll of their father's death had already left them reeling. Now they were facing not just the pain of loss, but the bitterness of being denied their birthright. In one particularly raw conversation between the siblings, Jake finally asked the question that had been eating at him for weeks. "Are we still their children, or just details that can be discarded?" The words hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt by both of them. No amount of legal jargon, no argument or plea could ever heal the wound that had been inflicted by that one simple question. For Romy, it was a question that broke her heart. She had never truly considered that her father might have seen her and Jake as mere afterthoughts. But the more she thought about it, the more the realization hit her. It wasn't just about what her father had left them. It was about what he hadn't left behind. His legacy was not for them to inherit, but for others to carry forward. And that felt like a deep, unshakable rejection. Jake's anger, though fierce, began to shift. What had started as rage at his father's decision began to transform into a need for closure. He wanted to understand why Rob had chosen this path, why he had made this final decision that tore his family apart. He wasn't sure he'd ever get the answers, but he had to try. The more he pushed for answers, the more he realized how little he truly knew about his father's inner world. Romy, on the other hand, began to withdraw. The fight for the inheritance was no longer just a matter of legal strategy. It had become a fight for something far more elusive. A sense of belonging, a place in a family that no longer existed the way she had once known it. And as the legal battle raged on, both siblings were left to contend with the realization that they were no longer just fighting for a share of their father's wealth. They were fighting for their place in the world he had left behind. The emotional toll was immense, and no legal victory could bring back the father they had lost. But in the midst of the battle, both Jake and Romy came to realize that perhaps the most important fight they could fight was the one for their own emotional healing. And that in the end might be the one battle worth winning.